Hello, my name's Elijah Wells, and today's review is James Cameron's new movie, Avatar: Fire and Ash. Taking place only a couple of weeks after the events of Way of the Water, Jake and Nerta, being portrayed by Sam Worthington and Zoe Saldana, are still mourning the loss of their son who was killed in a battle from the previous movie. And of course, there's a lot more complications at hand whilst there is still a mourning, particularly that Spider is having a really faulty battery in his air mask thing, and things only just get a lot more worse in here when they get ambushed by the Fire Tribe, and of course they're in cahoots with the Colonel, who still would not keep going after Jake Sully. There's a saying in pop culture now is that you should never ever bet against James Cameron, as in the man has already not just one, not two, but three movies that made $1 billion in the box office, and particularly Avatar, the first one in 2009, being the first film to reach $2 billion in the box office, and only just a couple of films actually to reach that landmark. So it was very interesting, particularly the first one, which is still one of my favourite films of all time, and definitely my introduction to James Cameron, who made complete sci-fi masterpieces like Terminator, T2, Aliens, Abyss, and as well as historical epics like Titanic, which is just one of the 3 films to win 11 Oscars, tied with Ben-Hur and Lord of the Rings, Return of the Kings, and of course, with the other logic of never bet against James Cameron is that he will always push his boundaries, pretty much on the theatrical side of things, and of course the technological side of things. Like, of course, this one being filmed back to back with Way of Water, which came out 3 years ago. That being the first film to use motion capture while capturing the said scenes underwater, which was pretty much unheard of at that point, and of course, the first one also broke grounds of how very digitized and very heavy on CGI it was, and how really nice it looked back then, and even still today, pretty much now memed on because a lot of CG today is not really that appeasing to the eye anymore. And also really utilizing motion capture to a much bigger scale. Let's say Lord of the Rings, which had like one character in motion capture. Well, this one had like a whole army in motion capture in character. So it was definitely a type of director who had always had something up his sleeves, and definitely wants to go further and further and more beyond, almost like a Tom Cruise type, as in he always wants to outdo himself and pretty much wants to keep pushing boundaries of what this technology can achieve. The movie has quite a host of plot threads there throughout the movie, particularly with Kiri coming to terms that she's essentially Space Jesus, and the Colonel in cahoots with the Fire Tribe and supplying them with all sorts of weaponry and a base within the human camp, and as well as Nitari being vengeful towards the humans after losing her son in the previous movie and pretty much cursing them out at every opportunity possible and still grieving with herself. And of course, the one pretty big one is that Spider now breathes normally in the atmosphere of Pandora, particularly when Kiri prayed over it with all these trees and herbs and weeds all around him, and how they all connected into him. And of course let them breathe very normally, which again somewhat puts Jake and Neytiri in a bit of an uncomfortable position, as in like, if humans can do this, then we're screwed in theory, as in if they exploit it, then we're pretty much screwed at this point. And of course a lot of these plot threads are definitely very interesting and definitely interwoven in a way that it does make the movie feel a lot more consistent, without some scenes that did drag on a little bit, but not to the point where it pretty much bogged down the pacing. And also something that me and my dad, who watched this movie, what we did find in this movie, and it was definitely very surprising, it's the amount of like religious and biblical imagery and symbolism in this movie. I have not the greatest idea if James Cameron is a Christian or has a lot of interest in Christianity, but it was definitely something I did find very interesting to see, and definitely took me by surprise, as in the movie does discuss like virgin birth, particularly that Kiri turns out never had a male never had a biological father, and of course, which does explain why she has all these powers, essentially on the same avenue, let's say Jesus. And of course, there's a scene that's almost reminiscent of Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac. There's a scene in there which I don't want to spoil too much, which definitely plays on that logic a lot more. And of course, there's Kiri's quest to find a godlike figure who is known as Awa, who's pretty much, and of course, her being an offspring of a godlike character, again, similar to Jesus. With all due respect, as much as the movie is definitely really great, I feel like the runtime is getting a tad too excessive at this point. Like, the movie's runtime is 3 hours and 15 minutes, when at this point, being the third installment and only a couple minutes longer than the second film, it's getting a little bit excessive at this point. Particularly, I feel like there's some plot threads they could at least trim down a little bit, or just could have done completely without, in my opinion. Like, for example, like Jake's son trying to reunite with the outcast whale, which I feel like they should have done in a way where he doesn't have to go through that journey, but the whale does go back eventually, completely all scarred with bullet holes, eyes gouged out, with a little bit of a huge shellings like dug into the whale's skin, and pretty much being encountered with the Council of Whales, which again I feel like it should have done that way rather than have the son like journey all the way out across the ocean to find it. And also the Colonel's discussion with the Fire Tribe, which I feel like, particularly with the Colonel being all high and finding the mistress, which I feel like they could have done a little bit without, just on sort of like, what does this contribute to the story? Like, we already know she is a danger. She doesn't trust sky people. She doesn't trust humans, and she's pretty much made you high. Like, what was the point in that scene? Like, I feel like they could have done without that one. And of course, I feel like seeing they could have played more as a montage is particularly Neytiri, who pretty much has a massive back and shoulder injury after being hit with an arrow in the first action scene, and pretty much spends her first half of the performance with a massive shoulder and back injury and pretty much out of action, pretty much trying to stretch an arrow and having like massive pain and aches in the back of her back, which I feel like should have been a montage, or at least trimmed it down a little bit, in my opinion. But even though I'm going to feel a little bit weird saying this, even though I did say the movie could have done without these scenes, the movie's runtime didn't feel that long actually, particularly with the 197-minute runtime, which is like 3 hours 17 minutes. It felt like it went on like 2.5 hours actually. Like, it didn't feel that long in my opinion. Like, I understand, like, even I myself get intimidated, like, really long run times, because, okay, we're gonna, like, feel every minute, just inching towards the end, but I feel like a lot of scenes did go by with a breeze, which, again, is a nice appeal, but I did notice these scenes, I feel like they kind of went without, because I'm not sure how much they could have contribute to the movie at the end, or just took the shortcut route, in my opinion. Another critique I have of this movie is the third act. Even though the movie is, again, like all the Avatar movies, they are definitely big, they're definitely grandiose, and definitely eye candy to the max, given that James Cameron is a full-blown maximalist and he delivers all the goods regardless of the quality of the movie. But I feel like the third act, it does feel a little too familiar from the previous two movies that came before. Like, we have the staying low before the big all-out ambush against the sky people and the humans, and the battle scene, and of course a battle scene that takes place on a sinking ship, familiar with Way of the Water, and of course whales and birds doing loads of damage to the enemy ships, which is from the previous two movies, and of course Kiri doing some Deus Ex Machina stuff, again similar to Way of Water, and of course there's the last of the third act, which definitely is probably the coolest of the battle scenes in my opinion, is pretty much it takes place on the floating rocks where the gravity is shooting upwards rather than usually just downwards. Of course, the wrecked up ship is pretty much propelling towards it, and it just gets sucked up with all the flames and all the carnage and all the wreckage that's like spilling off of it, and it's all like separating apart like it's being sucked into like a tornado or something, which is something I found like visually very cool. It's almost like video game like, particularly you can almost imagine yourself playing like a video game of it, like trying to jump from one rocky platform to another platform, and also be careful of like being burnt alive, and also having one of the shipwreckage parts like colliding into rocks and possibly shattering it or tilting it, which is again does give a lot more depth and a lot more like intensity to that scene, which I found a lot more cool. I wish of course it stuck to that a lot longer in my opinion, rather than the action scenes which I'm a little bit more familiar with at this point. Another unanswered question from the previous film Wave of Water is that why did the Colonel turn into an avatar? Of course, the unanswered question finally gets an answer, or kind of an answer in this movie, is that he has a sense of injustice for not completing his mission and not taking Jake Sully in. Or pretty much he just wants to finish what he started from the first film, and hopefully he will just do whatever he takes, regardless of how pretty much insane the methods he takes, particularly in this movie. The movie is definitely visually amazing, and it definitely gives Pandora a lot more new depth, and of course the movie tackles grief, revenge, and finding it in an elegant and well-meaning manner. Of course, it clears up a lot of the unanswered questions from the previous movie, but I feel like there were some scenes that definitely went on for a little bit too long in my opinion, and third act was a little bit too familiar in my opinion. Even though it didn't break as much ground as the first two films, I feel like it still blows me away despite the flaws, and I've still pretty much still capitalized that James Cameron should never be taking bets on. And of course, Avatar is still going to be a cornerstone of the sci-fi film industry at this point. So, for Avatar Fire and Ash, I am feeling a 7 out of 10 on this one. So, what do you think of Avatar Fire and Ash? Let me know in the comments down below, subscribe to my channel, like this video. You can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, and Letterboxd, and this is Elijah Wells, and bye.